Welcome to what is quite an unusual Good Friday service in that it's all digital, but you're welcome nonetheless in a time where we are going through even what seems to be familiar in very unfamiliar ways and having to learn new things and new ways of doing things. For the purpose of the reflection tonight is really a time that's for you to go through the journey with Jesus towards the cross, as we would do if we were gathered together in a church building. But the emphasis is much more on taking responsibility for our own footsteps through that journey. So you may want to have with you, after each reading, there's a time for you to talk to God with a couple of maybe thoughts and questions interspersed between. But you may want to have a piece of paper with you to write some thoughts down, or to write prayers down, or to take notes to come back to. You might want to do something else, like do some drawing or something creative while you're doing this and talking to God and praying through the different topics that we'll read through and cover in Jesus' final journey towards the cross. Or you might, for example, want to take a stone for each section. There are 8 different readings. Maybe you have small stones around about in the garden, and just place one in front of you, hold one while you're praying, and place one down. Something like that. I'm sure you'll come up with your own creativity and ways to work through this. But before we begin, I want to open and set the scene, in a sense, using some words that have been shared this week from the Reverend Dr. Leslie Stewart. And it's a reflection on Holy Week called Things Are Different Now. I wish I knew then what I know now, how precious time was as he walked among us. There were crowds and questions, the excitement of hearing and seeing, and some so blessed to know his touch. How quickly things can change, all in the blink of an eye, from cheers to jeers, from faith to fear, from celebrations to mourning. I wish I knew then what I know now, how precious all time is, as still he dwells among us. No crowds now, but questions remain. No chance to gather and hear and see in ways we have always known. Things are different now. The days are long, the nights are dark. Now testing times are here. Fears still need their release, hands still long to be held, and in private mourning, death is keenly felt. Things are different now. With those who once waited, we must wait, trusting in the life which will rise again. For we will declare, now as before, that he is risen. He is risen indeed. The shadow of betrayal. Judas Iscariot was one of the 12 disciples. He went to the chief priests and offered to help them arrest Jesus. They were glad to hear this, and they promised to pay him. So Judas started looking for a good chance to betray Jesus. It was the first day of the festival of thin bread, and the Passover lambs were being killed. Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover meal?" Jesus said to 2 of the disciples, "Go into the city, where you will meet a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him." The 2 disciples went into the city and found everything just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover meal. While Jesus and the 12 disciples were eating together that evening, he said, "The one who will betray me is now eating with me." This made the disciples sad, and one after another they said to Jesus, "You surely don't mean me." He answered, It is one of you 12 men who is eating from this dish with me. The Son of Man will die, just as the scriptures say, but it is going to be terrible for the one who betrays me. The man would be better off if he had never been born. The shadow of the agony of spirit and arrest. Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives, as he often did, and his disciples went with him. When they got there, he told them, "Pray that you won't be tested." Jesus walked on a little way further before he knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you will, please don't make me suffer by having me drink from this cup. But do what you want and not what I want." And then an angel from heaven came to help him. Jesus was in great pain and prayed so sincerely that his sweat fell to the ground like drops of blood. Jesus got up from praying and went over to his disciples. They were asleep and worn out from being so sad. He said to them, "Why are you asleep? Wake up and pray that you won't be tested." While Jesus was still speaking, a crowd came up. It was led by Judas, one of the 12 apostles. He went over to Jesus and greeted him with a kiss. Jesus asked Judas, "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Jesus was arrested and led away to the house of the high priest, while Peter followed at a distance. The shadow of denial. Jesus was arrested and led away to the house of the high priest, while Peter followed at a distance. Some people built a fire in the middle of the courtyard and were sitting around it. Peter sat there with them, and a servant girl saw him, and then after she looked at him carefully, she said, "This man was with Jesus." Peter said, "Woman, I don't even know that man." A little later, someone else saw Peter and said, "You're one of them." "No, I'm not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another man insisted, "This man must have been with Jesus. They both come from Galilee." Peter replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." And right then, while Peter was still speaking, a rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered that the Lord had said, "Before a rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will say 3 times that you don't know me." And then Peter went out and cried hard. The shadow of accusation. Early the next morning, the chief priests, the nation's leaders, and the teachers of the law of Moses met together with the whole Jewish council. They tied up Jesus and led him off to Pilate. He asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Those are your words," Jesus answered. The chief priests brought many charges against Jesus. Then Pilate questioned him again. "Don't you have anything to say? Don't you hear what crimes they say you've done?" But Jesus did not answer, and Pilate was amazed. During Passover, Pilate always freed one prisoner chosen by the people, and at that time there was a prisoner named Barabbas. He and some others had been arrested for murder during a riot. The crowd now came and asked Pilate to set a prisoner free, just as he usually did. Pilate asked them, "Do you want me to free the king of the Jews?" Pilate knew that the chief priests had brought Jesus to him because they were jealous. But the chief priests told the crowd to ask Pilate to free Barabbas. And then Pilate asked the crowd, "What do you want me to do with this man you say is the king of the Jews?" They yelled, "Nail him to a cross." Pilate asked, "But what crime has he done?" "Nail him to a cross," they yelled even louder. Pilate wanted to please the crowd, so he set Barabbas free. And then he ordered his soldiers to beat Jesus with a whip and nail him to a cross. The shadow of mockery. The governor's soldiers led Jesus into the fortress and brought together the rest of the troops. They stripped off Jesus' clothes and put a scarlet robe on him, and then made a crown of thorn branches and placed it on his head. And they put a stick in his right hand. The soldiers knelt down and pretended to worship him. They made fun of him and shouted, "Hey, you, King of the Jews!" Then they spit on him. They took the stick from him and beat him on the head with it. When the soldiers had finished making fun of Jesus, they took off the robe. They put his own clothes back on him and led him off to be nailed to a cross. The shadow of crucifixion. Two criminals were led out to be put to death with Jesus. When the soldiers came to the place called the Skull, they nailed Jesus to a cross. They also nailed the two criminals to crosses, one on each side of Jesus. Jesus said, "Father, forgive these people. They don't know what they're doing." While the crowd stood there watching Jesus, the soldiers gambled for his clothes. The leaders insulted him by saying, "He saved others, now he should save himself if he really is God's chosen Messiah." The soldiers made fun of Jesus and brought him some wine. They said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." Above him was a sign that said, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging there also insulted Jesus by saying, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and save us." But the other criminal told the first one off, "Don't you fear God? Aren't you getting the same punishment as this man? We got what was coming to us, but he didn't do anything wrong." And then he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into power." Jesus replied, "I promise that today you will be with me in paradise." The shadow of death. About noon, the sky turned dark and stayed that way until around 3 o'clock. Then about that time Jesus shouted, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you deserted me?" Some of the people standing there heard Jesus and said, "He's calling for Elijah." One of them ran and grabbed a sponge. After he had soaked it in wine, he put it on a stick and held it up to Jesus. He said, "Let's wait and see if Elijah will come and take him down." Jesus shouted and then died. At once, the curtain in the temple tore in two from top to bottom. A Roman army officer was standing in front of Jesus. When the officer saw how Jesus died, he said, "This man really was the Son of God." The shadow of burial. Joseph from Arimathea was one of Jesus' disciples. He had kept it secret, though, because he was afraid of the Jewish leaders. But now he asked Pilate to let him have Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission, and Joseph took it down from the cross. Nicodemus also came with about 75 pounds of spices made from myrrh and aloes. This was the same Nicodemus who had visited Jesus one night. The two men wrapped the body in a linen cloth together with the spices, which was how the Jewish people buried their dead. In the place where Jesus had been nailed to a cross, there was a garden with a tomb that had never been used. The tomb was nearby, and since it was the time to prepare for the Sabbath, they were in a hurry to put Jesus' body there. We've come out of the shadows in our own lives, which offer false protection. They keep our true selves hidden and sometimes afraid. And we've come into the open with all of the darkness within us. Sometimes with a degree of empathy of Jesus' experience, and sometimes with the guilt of having caused similar to ourselves, to others, or to God. And we find ourselves under a much bigger, much heavier shadow, which for now feels so dark and perhaps worse than our own shadows that we've shed. But this is a shadow like no other. This is a shadow under which light will come, that no darkness can ever overcome. This is the shadow of the cross of Jesus Christ, the Saviour of the world. In its shadow, we watch and wait for the rising of the sun. Amen.